Both he and Caroline were very fond of Ed's wife, Helen, and their new baby, Natalie as well. A visit from Natalie was one of the few things with the power to lift Caroline out of her own life these days, and sensing this, Helen brought her over frequently. Ed never complained. There were men, he knew, who wouldn't have cared to have the missus running to the old folks down the street every time the baby did some new and entrancing thing, especially when the granny figure in the picture was ill. Ralph had an idea that Ed wouldn't be able to tell someone to go to hell without suffering a sleepless night in consequence. But, "You fucking whore master, move your sour shit-caked ass! You hear me, butt-fucker cunt rammer?" But it sure sounded like Ed. Even from 200 or 300 yards away, it certainly sounded like him. Now the driver of the Datsun was running his engine like a kid in a muscle car waiting for the light to turn green. Clouds of exhaust smoke farted up from the tailpipe. As soon as the gate had retracted enough to allow the Datsun passage, the car leaped forward, squirted through the gap with its engine roaring, and when it did, Ralph got a clear look at the driver. He was close enough now for there to be no doubt. It was Ed, all right. The Datsun bounced along the short, unpaved stretch of lane between the gate and the Harris Street extension. A horn blared suddenly, and Ralph saw a blue Ford Ranger heading west on the extension, swerve to avoid the oncoming Datsun. The driver of the pickup saw the danger too late, and Ed apparently never saw it at all. It was only later that Ralph came up to consider Ed might have rammed the Ranger on purpose. There was a brief scream of tires, followed by the hollow bang of the Datsun fender driving into the Ford sidewall. The pickup was driven halfway across the yellow line. The Datsun stood crumpled, came unlatched, and popped up a little. Headlight glass tinkled into the street. A moment later, both vehicles were dead in the middle of the road, tangled together like some weird sculpture. Ralph stood where he was for the time being, watched as oil spread beneath the Datsun's front end. He had seen several road accidents in his almost 70 years, most of them minor, one or two serious, and he was always stunned by how quickly that happened and how little drama there was. It wasn't like in the movies where the camera could slow things down, or on a videotape where you could watch the car go off the cliff again and again if you so chose. There was usually a series of converging blurs, followed by that quick and toneless combination of sounds. The cry of the tires, the hollow bang of metal crimping metal, the tinkle of glass. Then, voila, tout fini. There was even a kind of protocol for this sort of thing. How one should behave when involved in a low-speed collision. Of course there was, Ralph mused. There were probably a dozen 2-bit collisions in Derry every day, and maybe twice that number in the wintertime when there was snow and the roads got slippery. There was even a kind of protocol for this sort of thing, how one should behave when involved in a low-speed collision. Of course there was, Ralph mused. There were probably a dozen 2-bit collisions in Derry every day, and maybe twice that number in the wintertime when there was snow and the roads got slippery. You got out, you met your opposite number at the point where the two vehicles had come together, and where quite often they were still entwined. You looked, you shook your heads. Sometimes, often actually, this phase of the encounter was marked with angry words. Fault was assigned, often rashly. Driving skills impugned, legal action threatened. Ralph supposed that the drivers were really trying to say, without coming right out and saying it, was, "Listen, you fool, you scared the living hell out of me." The final step in this unhappy little dance was the exchange of the sacred insurance screeds. And it was at this point that the drivers usually began to get control of their galloping emotions, always assuming that no one had been hurt, as appeared to be the case here. Sometimes the drivers involved even finished up by shaking hands. Ralph prepared to watch all this from his vantage point less than 150 yards away. But as soon as the driver's door of the Datsun opened, he understood that things were going to go differently here. That the accident was maybe not over, but still happening. It certainly did not seem that anyone was going to shake at the end of these festivities. The door did not swing open, it flew open. Ed Deepno leaped out, then simply stood stock still beside his car. His slim shoulders squared against a background of deepening clouds. He was wearing faded jeans and a t-shirt, and Ralph realized that before today he had never seen Ed in a shirt that didn't button up the front. And there was something around his neck, a long white something. A scarf? It looked like a scarf, but why would anyone be wearing a scarf on a day as hot as this one had been? Ed stood beside his wounded car for a moment, seeming to look in every direction but the right one. The fierce little pokes of his narrow head reminded Ralph of the way roosters studied their barnyard turf, looking for invaders and interlopers. Something about that similarity made Ralph feel uneasy. He had never seen Ed look that way before, and he supposed that was part of it. But it wasn't all of it. The truth of the matter was simply this: he had never seen anyone look exactly like that. Thunder rumbled in the west, louder now and closer. The man getting out of the Ranger would have made 2 of Ed Deepno, possibly 3. His vast, deep belly hung over the rolled waistband of his green chino work pants. There were sweat stains the size of dinner plates under the arms of his open-throated white shirt. He tipped back the bill of the West Side gardener's gimme cap he was wearing to get a better look at the man who had broadsided him. His heavy-jowled face was dead pale, except for bright patches of color like rouge high on his cheekbones. And Ralph thought, there's a man who's a prime candidate for a heart attack. If I was closer, I'd bet I'd be able to see the creases in his earlobes. Hey! The heaviest guy yelled at Ed. The voice coming out of that broad chest and deep gut was absurdly thin, almost reedy. Where'd you get your license? Fucking Sears and Roebuck? Ed's wandering, jabbing head swung immediately toward the sound of the big man's voice, seemed almost to home in like a jet guided by a radar, and Ralph got his first good look at Ed's eyes. He felt a bolt of alarm light up in his chest and suddenly began to run toward the accident. Ed, meanwhile, had started toward the man in the sweat-soaked white shirt and gimme cap. He was walking in a stiff-legged, high-shouldered strut that was nothing at all like his usual easy-going amble. "Ed!" Ralph shouted. But the freshening breeze, cold now with the promise of rain, seemed to snatch the words away before they could even get out of his mouth.